Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, having a conversation with Keldon Bester. He's the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project. Keldon, we're just talking about the impact on businesses. Presumably, small businesses are really quite impacted by this. Their costs are high and getting higher to produce or participate in the economy. What can be done to help them?
Well, I think the lesson to be learned is to go back and think about the relationship between who has power in a supply chain and what does that allow sort of a dominant player to do. So in the grocery space, we have several large grocers, and that gives them countervailing power against some of their larger suppliers. But it also allows them to dictate terms for smaller suppliers that depend on them for access to markets. So there's a couple of things we can do there. One is we can foster diverse markets where power is shared more equally, and businesses have to compete not only for customers but for their own suppliers. And we can also put limits on what companies can and can't do. Right now, there's an investigation and some regulatory activity around whether grocery stores can use property controls to limit where competitors are able to set up grocery stores that might compete with them. That's an example of something that's holding back competition, and that absent that, we would have a bit more of a balanced relationship between, for one thing, these big grocers and their more smaller suppliers.
No, that's a very good example. Another example, of course, is air travel. You mentioned that at the outset. So why is it so bad in that sector? And what is a potential solution there?
Well, something we need to wrangle with in Canada, very similar to countries actually like Chile and Australia, is that the structure and the layout of our population really runs counter to the current mode, hub and spoke model of airline operations.
Mm.
So we have to recognize that the market here is not necessarily geared up to serve Canadians, even though we do need air travel, especially for rural and remote communities. So there's a couple of things we can do there from the camp perspective. One is to try to pull costs out of the system. We think about the user fees for airports and air travel services and gear those towards favoring smaller airlines and actually smaller planes that we need to serve rural and remote communities. So
Right.
That along with some targeted support for truly small communities that depend on air service is one way to change the economics of the airline industry and hopefully make it easier to start and maintain some of the new players we've seen enter.
I know there's been a lot of debate, and I think there was a recent report indicating that potentially relaxing the foreign ownership rules in the air travel sector might be part of the solution. What do you think of that?
Well, we think it's less likely to be effective. So, one reason for that is competition and service is the poorest for some of the smallest communities in Canada. In a country like the US, you have companies pulling out of markets that are, three, four, five times the size of some of the markets in Canada. So, the idea that there is a foreign player that's really dying to serve these routes that again run counter to the economics of the airline industry, we think is a bit optimistic. So even before you get to kind of sovereignty and security concerns, we think just the juice really won't be worth the squeeze there.
Okay, gotcha. Um, let's talk about our wonderful neighbor to the south a little bit. I do want to get into the big tech aspect of this, but before we do, just sort of give our audience a little bit of an overview of what you're watching there and how it might impact Canada, let's say.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we're seeing right now, as I mentioned before, is that the monopoly story is the same whether we're talking about companies or countries. And we're finding that when the US wants to change the deal that we had with Canada, we are a bit at their whims. And we've seen that firsthand over the past 6 months. And so I think what the lesson to take away from this is not for Canada to pull away from the US necessarily, but to look at where we need to diversify and mitigate our exposure to what we feel like is a pretty big risk that for decades, really, we could pretend wasn't there because we thought we had this bedrock partnership with the US.
Yeah, I think that's really a key component of this, that we are, uh, that connection and connectedness on the one hand, but at the other hand, it kind of constrains activity and behavior here.